Disclaimer, I'm not actually a Greek mythology expert. I'm just a kid who grew up with very few friends. Hi, my name is Adriana, and this is an enthusiast guide to Greek mythology retellings. So from a very, very young age, I have been enthralled by Greek mythology. When I was about 6 years old, my grandparents went on a trip to Greece and brought me back, all sorts of little cool trinkets and stuff. And what really, really got me was my grandpa gifted me a copy of this illustrated copy of Greek myths. It is gorgeous. Every time he would come to visit, he would read me some of the myths in here. So I've read through this probably 12 times, at the very least 12 times. And I have been obsessed with Greek mythology ever since. It really took off when in 6th grade, I was in a drama camp and played Persephone in a Persephone and Hades play. And it's never stopped. I've been obsessed with Greek mythology the entirety of my life. And so when I got back into reading in about late 2018, early 2019 time frame, I was automatically drawn to all of these incredible feminist retellings of Greek mythology, and it is a genre that seems to be ever growing and ever expanding and getting more and more popular every year. And so I thought I would take this as a chance to talk through some of my impressions of Greek mythology as a whole, what makes a Greek mythology retelling, some different categories of Greek mythology retellings, what defines them, as well as give some recommendations of some of my favorite Greek mythology retellings and some of my not so favorite retellings but might be interesting to a certain genre of person, otherwise known as audience. So let's get started with a general overview of Greek mythology. If you are coming into this video with zero Greek mythology knowledge, basically the most modern analogy I can make to Greek mythology is something like Marvel or comic books, where you have this collection of characters with semi-defined origin stories and certain characteristics, and from there you can kind of insert them into any sort of story you want. So, in the Marvel universe, you have, the Avengers, and they have all their Avengers stories where they're all together doing a thing, but they all have their own individual origin stories, adventures, spin-offs, other universes, sometimes crossovers with other characters who aren't a part of their universe, and that's very, very akin to Greek mythology. So Greek mythology is obviously a very, very old practice, thousands of years BCE, and it was originally an oral tradition, meaning that none of these stories were written down, they were passed along verbally. So that is kind of why none of these stories have a specific canon, you could say, because everybody just kind of made up a story as they were going along. If you forgot a detail of a story, didn't matter. You could just make one up on the spot. No one's gonna check you because you're the one telling the story. As time went on, some specific Greeks and Romans decided to write some of these stories down, and that is where we get our sources of Greek mythology today. Probably the most famous example of someone deciding to write these stories down is Homer's The Iliad and the Odyssey, but there was tons of other poets and playwrights and a lot of other people doing the same thing. Hesiod, Ovid, Pseudo-Apollodorus. I'm gonna do my best with these Greek names. And oftentimes they are taking these stories and telling a story about a specific person, but then in the middle they'll just go on a tangent about a different myth. So today there is a field of study of the classicists, whose entire job it is to read through these ancient texts, parse out all of these stories within stories and plays with random tangents, and try to get out what we have defined as the canon of Greek mythology. And then, they get turned into super fun storybooks. Well, like this, with, the nice pages, and all of the myths are just nice in one bound up book. So, if you're interested in just learning about Greek mythology as a whole, just, learning the actual kind of canon stories, a great place to start is, obviously some sort of bind-up book like Book of Greek Myths, where it's just kind of written as they could have been told around a campfire back thousands and thousands of years ago. That's the way I got started. I think that's probably the way a lot of people get started. Another great resource is the internet. Just search Greek mythology stories, Greek mythology gods, Greek mythology heroes, and you're gonna get a whole litany of random sources that you can read through to your heart's content and learn all of these great stories. Once you kind of learn all of these great stories, if you want to move on into the next step of delving deeper into these stories, what they could mean, what they could have been describing to the Greek people, because Greek mythology was also a religion. A lot of these stories are explanations of the world around them and morals, and you can kind of look at Greek mythology in an anthropological sense. And some really great books for that is any sort of classics textbook. I took a classical mythology class in college. This is the textbook we had. It has a collection of all of the different Greek myths and kind of what they mean, what they meant to humans at the time, and going through the Renaissance. So, having a textbook like this, if you really want to get invested and interested, great place to start. Another book that I picked up fairly recently that I think is super, super great if you want to get into these feminist retellings and don't necessarily want to put in a ton of background work of learning all of the Greek myths, looking at a textbook, whatever, is Pandora's Jar by Natalie Haynes. Natalie Haynes is a trained classicist. She has a degree in the classics. She is also a comedian and is super funny and just very witty and intelligent. And so I think this book is a really great way to get an easy introduction into especially the feminist view of Greek mythology. Natalie Haynes has written a few Greek mythology retellings that will pop up on this list. This is a nonfiction collection looking at different female figures in Greek mythology and kind of talking about their backstory, looking at what could be a more feminist view of their stories. And something I really appreciated about this book is that she makes it well known that we can interpret these stories however we want because all those Greeks are dead. It doesn't really matter. That is a totally different civilization that doesn't exist anymore, and we can interpret it however we want because none of Greek mythology was written for women. If you read, the original kind of portrayals of these myths, it's never kind to women. Women are either vilified or killed, or both. So being able to kind of take that back, reinterpret these in a way that is empowering and feels good to read about as a woman is something that I think is really cool that is happening in literature today. So let's start getting into these retellings. I think probably one of the most popular form of retelling, maybe not the most popular, but it's definitely out there, people enjoy them, is some of the love stories from Greek mythology, specifically Hades and Persephone retellings, as well as Psyche and Eros retellings. The first thing that kind of pops into my mind is the Dark Olympus series. I think the first one is Persephone and Hades, and the second one is Psyche and Eros. So those pretty good representation of what this class of retelling has to offer. I mean, you can do any form of this. So Dark Olympus is a dark romance. I've only read the first one. What is it called? Wow, fake fan. I can't remember. It's up here. You can see it. But this is a very steamy, dark romance. You can also do something a little bit lighter, something like a Lore Olympus. Again, extremely popular Hades and Persephone retelling. But as far as, specific recommendations, these are the ones that I have read and enjoyed. Another Greek-inspired romance story, but it would be definitely a stretch to call this a retelling, is Lovely War by Julie Berry. This uses one of the Greek myths as a framing device. So again, tons of gods, all of them are getting into trouble, doing all sorts of crazy things. This is the love story of a different set of gods, slash not really love story of a different set of gods, but the gods are holding a trial for two gods that have a civil dispute and within the trial they tell a story, a love story from World War I, told from the perspective of each different god. Hades, the god of death, speaking as death in World War I. Aphrodite, the goddess of love, telling the love parts of the story. Ares, the god of war, telling the war parts of the story. So I would definitely recommend this, but more so if you are into historical romance with no spice, because it's mostly a historical romance with no spice. But it does have that kind of cool framing device if you are a Greek mythology nerd. So swinging a 180 from romance into young adult, I think this is where a lot of people first get into Greek mythology. You kind of sometimes learn about it in school and then become obsessed, or learn about it from friends or whatever else. So there is a lot of young adult Greek mythology literature out there. The most popular being Percy Jackson. So again, this is not really a retelling as much as it is an inspired, because it does take place in the modern day, but the Percy Jackson original series is pretty heavily inspired by Perseus and Medusa's story. The next series in Percy Jackson universe, The Lost Heroes, is pretty heavily inspired by Jason and the Argonauts. You can tell because the main characters of both of those series are named after the heroes of the myth. They are, written for children, but I think as far as young adults novels go, they are probably my personal favorite of what is out there. Like I said, this is a huge, huge genre of literature. There is no way I'm going to know them all. But here's some other ones that are a little less popular that could also be, fun for children. These two are from my childhood. It is a retelling of Helen of Troy before she gets taken off to Troy for the Trojan War. So about her upbringing as a kid in Sparta. These definitely fall more on the inspired by side, because in the original Homer telling of the Iliad, there's not a whole lot on Helen, besides she was pretty and she got kidnapped. There's also one I read a while ago and didn't like, and that was Daughter of Sparta. This one is inspired by Daphne and Apollo, and when I say inspired, put a heavy asterisk on that. I did not really see any sort of theming that fit the original myth, but I think this would be a really fun story for a young woman that is interested in girl boss mythology. Going a little bit younger, we have the Mythomania series. This was another favorite of mine in childhood. They are quippy and fun and sarcastic and are perfect for a preteen who just discovered sarcasm. They are all pretty direct retellings of the different Greek myths from the perspective of Hades, the god of the underworld. And as far as learning all of the Greek myths, these are not a bad way to start for someone who is a bit younger and you don't want them to be introduced to such dark themes being so young. Let's finish up with my favorite two categories of Greek mythology retellings, and that is the fantasy retelling route and the historical fiction retelling route. So in these two categories, they are pretty direct retellings, typically taking place in the heroic age or in the god age. And then the thing that makes them distinct is one includes all the gods and magic and stuff, and the other one does not do that and takes in just a historical fiction approach of what these myths might have actually happened like to turn into the oral tradition that we know and love today. So I think some really great examples of that kind of fantasy bend, stuff that includes the gods as characters, would obviously be something like Percy Jackson, where the gods do play an active part. Another really great example that is super popular and I would assume you've heard of is Circe by Madeline Miller. The main character is literally one of the gods. She's interacting with her family, who are all gods. She's interacting with fantastical monsters, as well as the human characters that she interacts with in the Odyssey. Again, that's kind of what I mean by like fantasy. The gods are real, they're characters, they have fantastical powers, blah blah blah. So along with Circe, we obviously also have the Song of Achilles. It still has the fantasy elements. I would still categorize it in that kind of fantasy sphere. Achilles' mother is described as a sea goddess. He is described as impervious except for his heel. But again, you probably already know about this one. If you were interested in Greek mythology retellings, you've probably already read this. Another one would be Ariadne by Jennifer Saint. Ariadne is a human character, but she marries a god, and the god is a part of the story and helps drive the plot. Another good one that I don't have because I did not enjoy it very much, but I think a lot of people did, so it might be worth looking at if it catches your eye, but that is Ithaca. Again, the goddess Hera plays a very large part in this book. Even though the gods and humans don't interact directly, the gods are still real within the context of the novel and moving the plot forward. Stone Blind by Natalie Haynes. Medusa, she's a monster. There's gods, goddesses, whole thing, fantasy, let's go. One that is kind of straddling that historical retelling and fantasy retelling line is something like 1,000 Ships. It feels very much like an ancient Greek play. You have like kind of a Greek chorus, you have a narrator character who is pulling you through the story, you have tons of perspectives, you're constantly jumping around. So this one doesn't read exactly like an ancient text, but it does kind of give you that same feeling that reading a translation of a ancient Greek play would feel like. Straddling more so into our historical fiction with just a tinge of fantasy would be Electra by Jennifer Saint. The gods are mentioned a lot, and there seems to be some magical realism happening, but we don't see the gods as characters directly, but we do kind of get a feeling that they're there and they are having an influence. We just don't see them directly. And that brings me to my absolute favorite of favorite, cream of the crop. These will always have a special place in my heart. The true historical fiction Greek retellings. I don't know what it is about it, but I love when an author takes a crazy, fantastical Greek myth and tries to figure out what could have happened in real life and had that story been retold over and over and over again, telephoned into the Greek myth. So it's like playing a game of reverse telephone from the Greek myth and figuring out what actually happened. And I love them and they are so fun. So let's go through it. So I think Claire Haywood is quickly becoming the queen of this category of Greek mythology retelling. She started off, I would say, with training wheels in the retelling of the Iliad with the daughters of Sparta. The Trojan War, while yes, in the original kind of canonical telling of the story, does include gods and fantasy nonsense, it's a very human story, and it's very easy to come up with a reason as to why people would be fighting and start a war. What I think is very, very impressive is her most recent release, and that is The Shadow of Perseus. The Greek myth this is based on is extremely fantastical. It is the story of Perseus slaying the head of the Gorgon Medusa, who is a terrifying monster. And so taking that story and turning it into such a human story that feels like it actually happened, a very impressive feat. Claire Haywood is part of the reason that this sector of Greek mythology retelling is becoming my favorite. Some other recent releases that I have really, really enjoyed have been Phaedra. This is the sister of Ariadne, who we mentioned in the fantasy part. This is an historical fiction take. So while her sister Ariadne's story is very fantastical, she gets married off to a god, Phaedra's story is a little more human, and it's, you know, in the ancient world, easy to explain away why your sister might have disappeared on an island without saying that she married a god. And then my last recommendation of this video is Clyde Nestra. Again, a very historic retelling type. And these Trojan War retellings, especially focusing on the character of Clytemnestra, I think are becoming really, really popular. Clytemnestra is one of those women in Greek mythology who was extremely vilified, and I think it's really admirable that so many of these authors are taking her story and expanding it to show that, yes, she was a villain, but like a very understandable villain. And for her time, maybe not all that villainous. So I really, really appreciated this book and its ability to make me actually appreciate the Trojan War, because I am a known Trojan War hater as far as retellings go. Those are basically all of the Greek mythology books I have ever read, and kind of what category they fall into, what kind of audience might be interested in them. If you have any questions about Greek mythology, I would love the excuse to talk about it more, because I'm obsessed. So please drop a comment down below, and thanks so much for watching, and I will catch you on the next video.